the thesis that I'm going to be arguing for is that regardless of the morality of an individual case of elective abortion, it would be unethical for the vast majority of first world countries that exist today to try to criminalize it. Okay, so a couple things that that need to be demonstrated for this argument to be true. One, that there is in fact a difference between what's ethical as a governmental action and what's ethical on an individual level. And I think that an obvious case of this would be, say, freedom of religion. I think if you're a Protestant Christian, then you presumably think that it's immoral to be an atheist, a Catholic, Orthodox, Muslim. However, I think the vast majority of Protestants would still say that it would be unethical for the United States government to try and criminalize being anything other than a Protestant. So I think that there are some very obvious cases where there is a difference between the ethical standards for a governmental action and for an individual action. I mean, another example could be, say, like adultery. That's something that we all consider to be immoral. I mean, presumably, it's something that is very intuitive to consider immoral. But I think most people would also say that it would be unethical for a government to try and criminalize that. So if we're not going to be using the same standards, then what standard should we use for whether something is ethical for a government to do? And I'll clarify what I mean by some of the words I'm going to use, but I'll say that the standard that we'll use is whether or not, consequentially, the action of a state is beneficial, explicitly that it has a positive effect, not that it is not negative, that it is a positive effect on the flourishing of the nation state as a unit. And by flourishing, I'll use, Deleuze's interpretation of Spinoza's interpretation, which is the capacity to affect and be affected, and by extension, the capacity to affect how one is affected and to be affected by the effects that one causes. I know it's like a mouthful, but it boils down to the capacity to affect and be affected. And I think that this standard, obviously when it comes to elective abortion, in the vast majority of first world countries, and at pretty much all practical consequences, any practical efforts to try and criminalize elective abortion in a first world country would harm the flourishing, by the definition, harm the flourishing of the nation state as a unit to affect and be affected. Because, well, for one, obviously there's correlation that we can kind of see empirically that the more powerful nations, the first world nations, tend to be more permissive when it comes to elective abortion than nations who are, say, have less of a capacity to affect and be affected. And I think that you can also just say, rationally, I think most people would agree that the widespread use of abortion or widespread acceptance of abortion allows women to, pursue education more frequently. The fact that you don't have unplanned pregnancies in general is just something that allows both men and women to have greater freedom, and by virtue of the fact that they have greater freedom and opportunities for success, that then allows the nation state as one unit to flourish more, per my definition. I think this also is something that can account for the fact that freedom of religion is something that most people would consider to be good, because any attempt in the United States to try and criminalize everything other than, even if it were a Protestant person, even if the government were entirely made up of Protestants, any attempt to criminalize all forms of belief other than Protestantism would cause so much damage to America, even just within internal conflict and the results of what that would entail practically, that would harm flourishing. I think similarly, you could say with adultery, the harms it would cause to privacy and the practical necessities for trying to institute punishment for this would end up harming the nation state's flourishing as a unit. Though even those are just two necessary examples. And I think, that's my argument.
Okay, thanks. So I think that the adultery example is a good example, because you're kind of drawing this private public distinction and what's the kind of proper reach of the state's arm. There's these private matters, there are the public matters, and people don't want the state to come into the bedroom and be punishing people for things that we agree are immoral, right? So I think that's a good example for you. So you might think maybe abortion is immoral, but it's not the purview of the state to get involved?
Yes, I would say that if we were to take, right now the president's Donald Trump, I think that there is a difference between him on an individual level going to an anti-abortion protest and him as a governmental action trying to use the state's power to criminalize abortion. So I think, there's a fundamental distinction here.
Okay. So I think that the people who want to make abortion illegal, what they think is that the fetus is an unborn child. And I think that they would say, a lot of the things that you said in support of not criminalizing abortion could just carry right over to like not criminalizing infanticide. So like, it's inconvenient to have a baby. And I could like do a lot better, like it would have been easier for me to like get tenure maybe if I like, you know, left my babies on some doorstep or like, you know, sorry, I'm having trouble going to the dark place where I like kill them. But that's like what the abortion people think. They think like you're killing babies. And so that's just, I'm sorry, the abortion people, the anti-abortion people. So they're like, yeah, we want women to flourish, we want people to have a great life, we're all for flourishing, but you can't kill babies. That's what they think. So like, what would you say to those people? Like, cause they're gonna, maybe they'll agree with you about adultery, they don't wanna criminalize adultery, but they wanna criminalize abortion, they don't want abortions because they think it's killing babies, and that's why they think it's different. So I offer you the infanticide example.
So what I would say is that when it comes to like infanticide specifically, I think that the reason why my, I guess, model of ethical action for states would be superior to like a rights-based version is that if we kind of grant like that, in the case of say like a right to life, if we generally grant that, what we end up having to do in a lot of cases is carve out a bunch of like exceptions for all the cases where we think someone loses a right to life. Like, oh, but in self-defense, we like have to carve out a special exception for that. You know, like maybe for the death penalty, like we can carve out an exception for that. Maybe in times of war, we can carve out an exception for that. And so I think that in general, I would say is that like the fact that my conception generally is like, I think even for like say a right to say like one important example from history would be say Abraham Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, like during the Civil War and following. That's a revocation of people's rights. Like in a literal sense, those people were disenfranchised. However, most people would say that that was something that was like ethical or like legitimate, I guess, like I'll say ethical for the government to do because it increased the from my justification would be that it increased the flourishing of the nation state as a unit. So I think that any rights-based attempt to come up with an ethical system kind of it ends up becoming very like it ends up just becoming like whatever my intuitions are is immoral because they end up just carving out specific rights. And I would say that for those who are opposed to for infanticide, if the question is like slippery slope, like they could allow infanticide, I think in that specific instance, the main thing is that like if you've already gone through, I think most of the, I guess, harm that is caused that ends up overflowing onto harm to the nation state as a unit is harm that is caused during the process of pregnancy, and I guess even from like obviously it's like from the fact that you have the children afterwards. But I think anyone who has already gone through the pregnancy, I think that the benefit that the nation state gains from criminalizing infanticide like immediately after birth is that would then say like, okay, we'll just give this baby to like an adoption center or something else because we're talking about first world countries here. So there are options that by the government like disallowing just killing your baby, and like I don't think that the harm that is caused by the disadvantage that is caused to the nation state as a unit as a result of making it so that if you want to like not have to deal with your child, like you have to go through the adoption center. I think that the benefit of making it so that's the only possible outlet, or I guess similar outlets, is actually beneficial because just the fact that you have more people in the nation state is something that benefits the flourishing of the nation state. So the fact that you can kill your baby when like you could just go to an adoption center, I don't think that that there's significant enough benefit to making it so that's the only possible way to, once you have a child, to stop having like no longer have that child. I think that there's enough benefit for the flourishing of the nation state.
So just like in a nutshell, tell me in a nutshell what your response is to someone who says, look, a lot of what you said carries over to the case of infanticide. Like just in a nutshell, what's the response where like, yes, we can criminalize infanticide, but not abortion? Like I think I heard. Yeah. I heard the core of a response, but you said a bunch of other stuff too, so I just want you to say like
so
the core
what it is
of
that Well, so obviously, obviously, the thing I would say is that trying to criminalize infanticide does not. That trying to criminalize infanticide is beneficial to the flourishing of the nation state as a unit in a way that trying to criminalize abortion is not. I think the fundamental reason is that like when you try and criminalize abortion, like you're preventing a lot of, well, obviously it's because you're causing harm to like women and also just to men, like the parents, and generally just like all the family members of the people who would have these unplanned pregnancies or unwanted pregnancies, that once you reach the point of having already gone through all of that, like if I were a woman who had just had a child and I like had the choice of either killing or like going to an adoption agency, I think that the government would have, like, that it would be better for the government, better for the nation and the state if I were to give that child to an adoption center. So I think it is more beneficial to the flourishing of the state and the nation state, I would say.
And so the difference has to do with like the burden of going through a pregnancy versus the burden of bringing an infant to an adoption agency.
Yeah, I think
that's the difference.
Yeah, I think
it's like unreasonable to ask women to bear that burden.
I think it's the consequences. I would say if it's like on an individual level, like even like we could say that even like that getting an abortion, like in any case, is immoral. But regardless of that, it would still be unethical to use the state to criminalize it. So I think that like a doctor who like refuses to provide abortion services, like I think that whether or not that's immoral, right, or moral or not for them to try, or whether they have an imperative to try and do that, is outside the scope of the argument that I'm making. I think that regardless of whether there is like a moral imperative to stop, to like try and prevent abortions or even just like not to have them yourself, I think that it would be ethical for the state to try and use that power.
And that's not because of the private-public sphere.
No, it's because of the
it's because of flourishing.
I think that the private-public distinction is, I would say, instrumental to the good that is the flourishing of the nation state. So I think that like the reason as to why like having a government that is like invading privacy in the sense that would be necessary for practical criminalization of adultery, that the result of that would harm the flourishing of the nation state. But I think that all these like other principles are subordinate to that, to the principle of my original thesis.
So it kind of sounds like, just abstracting a little bit away from the details of the flourishing stuff, there's consequentialism.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
The right action is the action that will bring about the best consequences. Then utilitarianism is like what you get when you take consequentialism and you slot out the best is like the thing that brings about the greatest happiness. Then there's rule utilitarianism or rule consequentialism, which says like the rules that we should adopt as a society, or like the rules that are the rules that we should follow, are the rules which are such that if we follow them, that'll bring about the best consequences.
Yeah.
And it kind of sounds to me like you're making some kind of consequentialist argument.
Yeah, I would say.
Where like instead of talking about happiness, you're talking about flourishing.
Yes.
But we want to bring about flourishing.
Yes.
So can you, because I'm kind of familiar with that way of thinking about things, so can you talk me through your point by putting it in that like slightly more.
So I would say that yes, it's about the consequences. So I would say, like as an example, Japanese internment camps. That would be unethical, because even if FDR did genuinely think that by doing that he was promoting the flourishing of the United States, the fact that we now, we historically, empirically know that there was not like this profusion of Japanese spies in the United States who were turning on America. So the fact that even if FDR was using some rule that was like, I'm always going to try and maximize what I think personally is the flourishing, the fact that it didn't actually end up doing that as an individual action makes it unethical for him to try and do that.
Okay.
Yes.
That's a helpful example, because somebody might say it doesn't matter what the consequences were. Like even if the consequences in making the Japanese Americans live in these internment camps, even if that would have had good consequences, still not okay.
I would say that in the situation where, I think even obviously there were if we're talking about, because my original thesis is talking about right now, current first world nations, I think that trying to do something like if we're talking about now specifically, trying to do something like that practically would end up causing more harm. Like, at least this is my prediction. I would say that, like, if we were to go to war with, like, I mean, we went to war with Iran. I think that if Trump were to try and, that, like, even if, like, really, like, there was this profusion of, like, the majority of Iranian Americans who are living here were spies and were turning on the United States. I think that the harm of trying to institute a policy like that would practically try and do that, at least in the modern day, would cause enough harm to the flourishing. However, I would say that if there were some very idealized world that was said that, like, if you could do this and, like, that wouldn't have negative consequences for this nation state, I think that you could say that would be permissible. However, I do think that situation is so far from, like, anything that's practically the case that it really, like, that I don't think it could ever really apply to a contemporary first world nation.
Okay. So it's just because some of the things that now I understand why a little while ago you started talking about rights, because, like, there are some things that we think should be protected regardless of the consequences. Like, I mean, I hope this doesn't take us too far afield, but if you think about, like, democracy, like, you know, they talk about this in political philosophy, like, is it obvious that by having a democracy, we get the best results? Like, if we wanted to get the best person in the office, should we have a democracy? And it's like, empirical question, right? Like, but we're committed to it anyway, like, regardless, even if, like, people are stupid and we make terrible choices and we end up in a bad situation, like, still, democracy, that's what we want. And another example might be, like, free speech. Like, we want free speech. A lot of times things people are saying are false and it causes bad consequences to happen, but we still want free speech protections. And I think that's how the abortion people feel about what they think are unborn children. They think, like, it doesn't matter, like, what the consequences are. So I think that they would put protecting unborn children, or what we would, what their opponents would call a fetus, they're like, that's an unborn child. And I think they want to say there are certain things that are sacred and it doesn't matter what the consequences are. So I'm just wondering, like, what would you say, like, do you reject that picture totally, or do you have, like, a more, do you have to reject that picture, or is there, like, a more nuanced thing?
There's a couple. So one, if we're talking about democracy, I would say that, well, I mean, I took the definition of flourishing from like an interpretation of Spinoza.
Yeah, that's why I was like, let's not talk about that, because I don't know anything about Spinoza.
Yeah, but, like, Spinoza did advocate for democracy, because he said that, like, he thought, because even though, in spite of the fact that his ethical system was, like, moral non-realist and sentimentalist, and the fact that he was a psychological egoist, he still thought that, like, people naturally pursuing their best interests are going to pursue democracy, because their highest interests, like, are, like, even if we could say that, like, there's lots of instances of democracy not panning out in, like, a way that we would consider, like, optimal. I would say, however, that practically, like, the reason as to why we gravitate to democracy is the fact that it eliminates a lot of biases, the fact that you're able to effectively aggregate a bunch of different, like, it's the closest we could get to, like, constantly taking surveys of what everyone's opinions are, while also, I mean, obviously we live in a representative democracy, but, like, different forms of democracy are things that, generally speaking, like even if I were the most, like, just like a pure egoist, I would still rather live in a democratic nation, at least right now. And I think that even if, like, rationally, like, why, like, I wonder why, like, could you really not have a dictatorship? I think empirically, like, we can see that, like, the most powerful nations, at least, have been the more liberal ones. I think that, like, even if we're talking about, like, some hyper-imperialist, like, we're only out for ourselves nation, like, following World War I and World War II, like, the formation of the EU and just cooperation between nations and, like, liberalizing like that brought about immense flourishing that I don't think would have been possible had, like, they all stayed fascist, even if they had like the greatest military power. I think that, like, it's just not like, I think that it's been demonstrated that democracy and sort of principles like these are beneficial for the flourishing of a nation state. I would say, in terms of abortion, when it comes to the rights thing, I'd again be a bit skeptical of the fact that, like, there are so many instances where, like, you have to suspend someone's right to life in general, where you have to be like, oh, well, in self-defense, that's fine, and, like, oh, the death penalty, that's fine, but also, like, and, like, oh, war, that's also fine, and, like, the fact that you have to make all these different carve-outs, I think suggests that like, I think that in a lot of cases, people are just generally like using their intuition for that. I think that the fact that like most of the time, if you ask, okay, well, why is like the death penalty fine? And it's like, oh, well, it's because like the nation can't really like pay for all these people, and like, you know, like you have to, it'd be more efficient. And like, that's an appeal to what my principle is, the flourishing of the nation state. So I think that like, usually, you're like, oh, self-defense. Yeah, but like if you prevented self-defense, then like, you know, like you have, then like if people can never defend themselves against these people, then like, you know, like that would be harmful for the nation state, I think. Like you can eventually extrapolate, that's the end reason. So I think that my principle kind of cuts back to like what the bare principle that everyone is kind of appealing to is. So I think that's why.
So insofar as we think that certain things are sacred,
Yeah.
ultimately you're gonna explain our attachment to those things by reference
Yeah.
to their role in bringing
yeah.
it up.
One thing I would also say is that like in a situation where say like the United States were like completely like everyone were anti-abortion, and like it was like I think that perhaps you can make an argument that in that situation, legalizing abortion would be unethical for the state to do, because the conflict that would cause within the state itself would end up harming the flourishing. So I think that you could say that like the average citizen, like if you did think like on an individual level it was a moral obligation to oppose abortion and to stop it, I think that you could still say that like by like having mass protest and like
just a couple more sentences.
Yeah.
And then we're
Okay,
done.
yeah. I think that by saying that like by adopting the principle that you're going to just try and make people convert to your ideology, can then therefore impact what the imperative of the state is.
So this
Okay.
really is a different argument from someone who says like
Yeah.
the right to abortion is like grounded in
Yeah.
the woman's right to determine what happens.
Yeah.
in her body.
Okay, that's time.
Okay.
Thank you.